Hello everyone, this is Fantastic Worlds, welcoming you back to Lovecraft Country, and even here in Lovecraft Country received our shelter-in-place orders, so I figure what better place to shelter than the abandoned Numbers station down in the depths of rural Romania. Just a moment, let me seal the door here. There we go. That should be good enough to keep me sealed in while the quarantine is going on. It's a crazy world out there. So here, let me pull up the old internets and see how the rest of the world is doing. Ah, things seem to be getting interesting. Very interesting out there. And it looks like I'm not the only one that's decided to bury myself half a kilometer underground. Looks like the 1% have been running off to their own little hidey holes, lovingly constructed by the modern equivalent of vault tech, some of them even containing bowling alleys and swimming pools. Some of them, of course, are running off to their mansions deep into unnamed islands in the Pacific Ocean, and running to New Zealand. Okay, the last one kind of got me by surprise. But this reminds me of a story, and I have been promising you a story for since we hit 100 subscribers, and I do apologize for the delay on that. It has been rather hectic, all things considered. But originally I was going to give you the Lovecraft story From Beyond, but recent circumstances have inspired me to change that to a bit. So what I'm going to be doing is Edgar Allan Poe's The Masque of the Red Death, which seems a bit timely. So sit back and let myself regale you with the master of horror. Edgar Allan Poe should need no introduction. After all, he is one of the grand masters of horror, being one of the inspirations for Lovecraft himself. He was first published The Masque of Red Death in 1842, and in his time, plague was more common and commonly accepted as a reality in life. Indeed, this one seems to have caught us by surprise simply because modern medicine has removed so many other problems before, and now we find ourselves back in the same sort of straits our ancestors were. So, without further ado, the Masque of the Red Death. The Red Death had long devastated the country. No pestilence had ever been so fatal or so hideous. Blood was its avatar and its seal, the madness and the horror of blood. There were sharp pains and sudden dizziness, and then profuse bleeding at the pores with dissolution. The scarlet stain upon the body, and especially upon the face of the victim, were the pest band which shut him out from the aid and from the sympathy of his fellow men. And the whole seizure, progress, and termination of the disease were incidents of half an hour. But Prince Prospero was happy and dauntless and sagacious. When his domains were half depopulated, he summoned to his presence 1,000 hale and light-hearted friends from among the knights and dames of his courts, and with these retired to the deep seclusion of one of his crenellated abbeys. This was an extensive and magnificent structure, the creation of the prince's own eccentric yet august taste. A strong and lofty wall girded it in. The wall had gates of iron. The courtiers, having entered, brought furnaces and massy hammers and welded the bolts. They resolved to leave means neither of ingress nor egress to the sudden impulses of despair or of frenzy from within. The abbey was amply provisioned. With such precautions, the courtiers might bid defiance to contagion. The external world could take care of itself. In the meantime, it was folly to grieve or to think. The prince had provided all appliances of pleasure. There were buffoons, there were improvisatoro, there were ballet dancers, there were musicians, there was beauty, there was wine. All these in security were within. Without was the Red Death. It was towards the close of the 5th or 6th month of his seclusion that Prince Prospero entertained his 1,000 friends at a masked ball of the most unusual magnificence. It was a voluptuous scene, that masquerade, but first let me tell you of the rooms in which it was held. There were 7, an imperial suite. In many palaces, however, such suites form a long and straight vista, while the folding doors slide back nearly to the walls on either hand, so that the view of the whole extant is scarcely impeded. Here the case was very different. As might be expected from the Duke's love of the bazaar, The apartments were so irregularly disposed that the vision embraced but little more than one at a time. There was a sharp turn at the right and left. In the middle of each wall, a tall and narrow Gothic window looked out upon a closed corridor of which pursued the windings of the suite. These windows were of stained glass whose color varied in accordance with the prevailing hue of the decorations of the chamber into which it opened. That at the eastern extremity was hung, for example, in blue, and vividly blue were its windows. The second chamber was purple in its ornaments and tapestries, and here the panes were purple. The third was green throughout, and so were its casements. The fourth was furnished and lightened with orange, the fifth with white, the sixth with violet. The seventh apartment was closely shrouded in black velvet tapestries that hung all over the ceiling and down the walls, falling in heavy folds upon a carpet of the same material and hue. But in this chamber only the color of the window failed to correspond with the decorations. The panes were scarlet, a deep blood color. Now in no one of these 7 apartments was there any lamp or candelabrum. Amidst the profusion of golden ornaments that lay scattered to and fro depended from the roof, there was no light of any kind emanating from the candle or lamp within the suite of the chambers. But in the quarters that followed the suite, there stood opposite each window a heavy tripod, bearing a brazier of fire that projected its rays through the tinted glass, and so glaringly lit the room. And thus were produced a multitude of gaudy and fantastic appearances. But in the western or back chamber the effect of firelight that streamed upon the dark hangings through the blood-tinted panes was ghastly in the extreme, and produced so wild a look upon the countenance of those who entered, that there were few in the company bold enough to set foot within its precincts at all. It was within this apartment also that there stood against the western wall a gigantic clock of ebony. Its pendulum swung to and fro with a dull, heavy, monotonous clang, and when the minute hand made the circuit of the face, and the hour was to be stricken, there came from the brazen lungs of the clock a sound which was clear, and loud, and deep, and exceedingly musical, but of so peculiar a note and emphasis that at each lapse of an hour the musicians of the orchestra were constrained to pause momentarily in their performance, to hearken to the sound, and thus the waltzers perforce ceased their evolutions, and there was a brief disconcert of the whole gay company. And while the chimes of the clock yet rang, it was observed that the giddiest grew pale, that the more aged and sedate passed their hands over their brows as if in confused reverie or meditation. But when the echoes had fully ceased, a light laughter at once pervaded the assembly. The musicians looked at each other and smiled as if at their own nervousness and folly, and made a whispering vow, each to the other, that the next chiming of the clock should produce in them no similar emotion. And then, after the lapse of 60 minutes, which embraced 3,600 seconds of time that flies, there came yet another chiming of the clock, and there was the same disconcert and tremulousness and meditation as before. But in spite of these things, it was a gay and magnificent revel. The tastes of the Duke were peculiar. He had a fine eye for color and effects. He disregarded the decora of mere fashion. His plans were bold and fiery, and his conceptions glowed with barbaric lustre. There were some who had thought him mad. His followers felt that he was not. It was necessary to hear and see and touch him to be sure he was not. He had directed in great part the movable embellishments of the 7 chambers. Upon this occasion of the great fete, it was his own guiding taste which gave him character to the masqueraders. But sure they were grotesque. There was much glare and glitter and piquancy and phantasm, much of what has been seen in the Hernai. There were arabesque figures with unsuited limbs and appointments. There were delirious fancies such as the madman fashions. There were much of the beautiful, much of the wanton, much of the bizarre, something of the terrible, and not a little of that which has excited disgust. To and fro in the 7 chambers stalked and fought a multitude of dreams, and these dreams writhed in and about, taking hue from the rooms, and causing the wild music of the orchestra to seem as the echo of their steps, and anon there struck the ebony clock which stands in the hall of velvet. And then for a moment all is still, all is silent save for the voice of the clock. The dreams are stiff frozen as they stand, but the echoes of the chime die away. They have endured but an instant, and a light half-subdued laughter floats after them as they depart. And now the music swells, and the dreams live, and writhe to and fro more merrily than ever, taking hue from the many-tinted windows from which streams the rays of the tripod. But to the chamber which lies most westwardly of the seven, there are now none of the maskers who venture, for the night is waning away, and there flows a ruddier light through the blood-colored panes, and the darkness of the sable drapery appalls, and to him whose foot fall upon the stable carpet, there comes from the near clock of ebony a muffled peal, more solemnly emphatic than any which reaches their ears, who indulge the more remote gaieties of the other apartments. But these other apartments were densely crowded, and in them beat feverishly the heart of life, and the revel went whirling on until at length there commenced the sounding of midnight upon the clock, and then the music ceased, as I have told, and the evolutions of the waltzers were quieted, and there was an uneasy cessation of all things as before. But now there were 12 strokes to be sounded by the bell of the clock, and thus it happened perhaps that more of thought crept, and more of time into the meditations of the thoughtful among those who revelled. And thus too it happened that before the last echoes of the last chime had utterly sunk into silence, there were many individuals in the crowd who had found leisure to become aware of the presence of a masked figure, which had arrested the attention of no single individual before. And the rumor of this presence having spread itself whispering around, there arose at length from the company a buzz or murmur of horror and of disgust. In an assembly of phantasms such as I have painted, it may well be supposed that no ordinary appearance could have excited such sensation. In truth, the masquerade license of the night was nearly unlimited, but the figure in question had out-Herod, and gone beyond the bounds of even the prince's indefinite decorum. There are chords in the heart of the most reckless which cannot be touched without emotion. Even the utterly lost, to whom life and death are equally jests, there are manners of which no jest can be made. The whole company, indeed, seemed now deeply to feel that in the costume and bearing of the stranger neither wit nor propriety existed. The figure was tall and gaunt, and shrouded from head to foot in the trappings of the grave. The mask which concealed the visage was made so nearly to resemble the countenance of a stiffened corpse that the closest scrutiny might have difficulty in detecting the cheat. And yet all this might have been endured, if not approved by the mad revellers around. But the mummer had gone so far as to assume the type of the Red Death. His vesture was dabbled in blood, and his broad brow, with all the features of his face, was bespeckled with the scarlet horror. When the eyes of Prince Prospero fell upon this spectral image, which with a slow and solemn movement, as if more fully to sustain its role, stalked to and fro among the waltzers, he was seen to be convulsed, in the first moment with a strong shudder of either terror or distaste, but in the next his brow reddened with rage. "Who dares?" he demanded hoarsely of the courtiers who stood near him. "Who dares insult us with this blasphemous mockery? Seize him and unmask him, that we might know whom we have to hang at sunrise from the battlements." It was in the eastern or blue chamber in which stood Prince Prospero as he uttered these words. They rang throughout the 7 rooms loudly and clearly, for the prince was a bold and robust man, and the music had become hushed at the waving of his hand. It was in the blue room where stood the prince, with a group of pale courtiers by his side. At first, as he spoke, there was a slight rushing movement of this group in the direction of the intruder, who at the moment was also near at hand, and now with deliberate and stately step made closer approach to the speaker, but with a certain nameless awe from which the mad assumptions of the mummer had inspired within the whole party. There was found none who put forth a hand to seize him, so that, unimpeded, he passed within a yard of the prince's person, and while the vast assembly, as with one impulse, shrank from the centres of the room to the walls, he made his way uninterruptedly, but with the same solemn and measured step which had distinguished him from the first. Through the blue chamber to the purple to the green, through the green to the orange, and through this again to the white, were even thence into the violet, ere a decided movement had been made to arrest him. It was then, however, that the Prince Prospero, maddened with rage and the shame of his own momentary cowardice, rushed hurriedly through the 6 chambers, while none followed him on account of a deadly terror that had seized upon all. He bore aloft a drawn dagger and approached in rapid pace to within 3 or 4 feet of the retreating figure, when the latter, having attained the extremity of the velvet apartment, turned suddenly and confronted his pursuer. There was a sharp cry, and the dagger dropped gleaming upon the sable carpet, upon which most instantly fell, prostrate in death, the Prince Prospero. Then, summoning the wild courage of despair, a throng of the revelers at once threw themselves into the black apartment, and seizing the mummer, whose tall figure stood erect and motionless within the shadow of the ebony clock, gasped in unutterable horror at finding the grave cerements and corpse-like mask, which they'd handled so violent a rudeness, untenanted by any tangible form. And now was acknowledged the presence of the Red Death. He had come upon them like a thief in the night, and one by one dropped the revelers in the blood-bedewed halls of their revel, and died each in a despairing posture of his fall. And the life of the ebony clock went out with that of the last of the gay, and the flames of the tripods expired, and darkness and decay and the Red Death held illimitable domain over all. I hope you enjoyed that little masterpiece from Poe. It's one of those famous ones, and, there are others we may touch upon in the future. Now, hearing this story upon a damned party and a stranger wearing a mask that is no mask, I am reminded of another person who is inspired by Poe. That, of course, is of Robert Chambers and his masterwork, The Yellow King, which has a play involving another mysterious stranger who wears no mask and brings damnation to a group of spoiled nobles. Do you ever want me to read that one? Let me know in the comments, because I'm open to doing more than just Poe or Lovecraft or the more common members of the cosmic horror genre. In fact, if you have any suggestions about what I might read for the next bonus episode, which, as the numbers rise, will likely be unlocked soon, please let me know down in the comments as well. I'm open to anything in the cosmic genre that's within the public domain, so keep in mind that anything recent is going to be unable to be broadcast on YouTube. And, of course, in our own, shall we say, quiet revels within this plague, do be safe. Take care. Stay home if you can. Mask up if you cannot. Wash your hands constantly and be safe. The next reading will be unlocked at 125 subscribers, which is only 3 away from our current total. However, as much as I'd like to imagine these readings being the reason doing so, I have promised that at 150 I will be doing the demo for the Lovecraftian quote-unquote erotic thriller Lust from Beyond. Blind and snarky as hell. And of course, if you want to see that, like, share, subscribe, especially subscribe. And if you really like what I'm doing, down below in the description are links to the Gumroad payment platform. If we reach certain stretch goals, new series and new options will be unlocked. The next one will be that of the Secret World Lore Hunter series, which is me discovering the hidden lore of the Secret World Lovecraft MMO. And if you haven't seen that, I'll put a link up to the top here, right? If I remember. If I don't, shout at me. That will lead you to the current ongoing series in that game. Well, I hope you enjoyed this. This has been Fantastic Worlds, deep in the depths of the Romanian rural countryside in an abandoned 1970s red Soviet numbers station, saying farewell from Lovecraft Country, and be safe.